Welcome to ePathshala PG courses on computer science. The module is about networking, Java networking in the course web technology. The objective of this module is to understand the basics of networking. We will see about IP addresses, ports, protocols, and how a client can communicate with the server, the interaction between the client and the server. We will also understand the fundamentals of Java functions supported for networking. Come to know about the internet address that can be retrieved using a specific class called InetAddress class supported in Java, and we will also get an idea about the URL class. So, why we choose Java for networking? So, Java practically we will know that it is a synonym for internet programming. It generates secure cross-platform and portable code. It is a platform independent language, programming language. It provides a platform as well as we can do programming with Java, and we have a complete network package called java.net.star, and we have a support for doing I/O with Java that is supported by a package called java.io, and you have a lot of classes and interfaces within that package, and this I/O is well needed for doing a TCP IP communication between a client and a server, and threading is also very useful, and it is also relatively easy that can be supported with Java. So, this Java provides a programming language which provides a very easier way of making communication between a client and a server. And let us see about, before going into the how we work with networking using the Java functions, let us see about the internet addresses, or we call it as IP addresses. We too call it as internet protocol addresses. We know we have already seen about this IP, the basics of IP addresses in the earlier modules. Now, we will see this is very essential, and IP address is very essential to find out or to connect to any host in the internet. And this is a unique ID which is given to any system that is connected in the network. So, every host on internet has a unique IP address. An IP address would be looking like this. We can see an IP address looks like it is in the form of decimal digits. It is also called as 4 octets, and this is a 32-bit IP address by which we can uniquely identify any host in the internet. And we can also identify a host by a host name string. So, this is very difficult to remember the host with an IP address or internet address would be very difficult. So, we can also go for a more convenient way of remembering a host by its host name. A host name would be looking like this. So, separated by dots, you can see that it can be a csc.ust.hk, or it can be auist.net, or it can be a local host. So, if we are not getting connected to the network, then you can make a communication within your system, which would be now called as a local host. And we can also have one host name which can correspond to multiple internet addresses. Say for example, you have a host name like yahoo.com. This has got 4 and more IP addresses. So, you can have one host name that can be associated with multiple internet addresses, or you can have every host would be identified with a single internet address or IP address. And domain name service or domain name system is a one which maps these host names to numbers or IP addresses. All these basics we have already discussed in the earlier modules. And coming to what is meant by port. So, we know that many different services are running on the host, and each service can be uniquely identified by a port that is running within the host. And we know that there are standard port numbers for, or pre-assigned port numbers for some of the services like time of day, whose port number is 13, FTP the port number is 21, Telnet, the pre-assigned port number is 23, and for doing an SMTP communication the port number is 25, and for doing a HTTP communication the pre-assigned port number is 80. So, there are pre-assigned port numbers for different services, and apart from these services we can also have many other services that can be running on a system. And any service, multiple services, when it is running on the system, each and every service would be identified or would be running in a different port number. So, will know that this IP address plus port number would be the number by which we can identify the service in the internet. This IP address is required to identify a host in the internet, and the port number is useful to identify the particular service in within the host. And let us see what is a protocol. Protocol are the rules that facilitate communication between the machines. We know that is a standard protocol to work in the internet is the TCP/IP protocol. There are lot of protocols that are running in the application layer. We know that HTTP is a protocol which is called as the hypertext transfer protocol for communication between a mail server and any of the web clients, and FTP is a file transfer protocol useful for transferring files between the host, and SMTP is a simple mail transfer protocol for making mail communication between systems, and TCP is a transmission control protocol running in the transport layer for making the communication between the host, and UDP is a protocol called user datagram protocol, which is specifically we use this protocol, the UDP protocol, for critical applications like video delivery. So, these are some of the protocols we have already come across, and these protocols are standardized and documented. So, we know that the machines can reliably work with one another when the protocol become a standard one. And let us see how a client interact with the server. We know that the communication between hosts is two-way. Usually the two hosts take different roles. So, we will call one host as a server, the other host as a client. The server is the host which waits for the client to make request. So, server initially would register on a known port with the host, and it will be running in an endless loop, listening for the incoming client connections, and client calls server to start a conversation. So, the client makes a request to the server by giving the host name or IP address and the port number where the service is running on the server system. Now, it sends the request and waits for the response from the server. So, this is how a client and a server makes a communication between them. So, it is a two-way communication that happens between the two different hosts. And we know that the standard service is always running between the client and servers, or FTP, HTTP, SMTP, which we normally come across in our daily use of several web services or any communication between the browser and any of the web server. And these servers offer shared resource. When a client wants to interact with the server would offer the shared resource like information, database, files, printer, compute power to the clients. And we also know that there is a protocol called Telnet protocol which would use to communicate with the remote server. So, this Telnet assumes to be running on a port number 23, and we also have an optional argument to make this Telnet run in a different port, but nowadays many servers refuse this Telnet connections due to security reasons. And how do this networking is supported with Java? So, we know that there is a networking package in Java called java.net, and within this package we have lot of classes and interfaces. We will come to see or know the classes which would be useful for doing a communication between the client and the server. The Java programs can use either a TCP communication or UDP communication over the internet. So, TCP is a reliable communication where for every packet that is sent between the host, there would be an acknowledgement expected by the other system. Whereas for an UDP, it's an unreliable communication. Even if there is a loss in the data packet, the one that has sent the data would not worry about, or the one that has received would not worry about. So, you can either make a TCP communication to interact or an UDP communication to interact based on the type of application we prefer. And we come to know that there is a class called URL or URL connection class within this networking package, which would be useful for doing web applications. And there are classes called socket, server socket classes. This is for making client server applications, and this server or server socket or socket class is useful for making TCP communication over the internet. And we have classes called datagram packet, datagram socket and multicast socket. This is for use within UDP communication. So, we will see in detail about the different classes which are essential for making this communication possible. And now coming to with Java networking, we will be working with internet address, we will be working with the URL class, we will be working with the class called URL connection class, and we will also do socket programming. So, now let us see about an important class called InetAddress class. Without this class, no communication is possible. So, this InetAddress class is used to encapsulate both the numerical IP address and the domain name for that address. So, for any host would be identified by a host name and its unique IP address. So, this InetAddress would be binded or encapsulated with both the IP address as well as with the domain name for that address. And this is a class which converts. You have several methods using which we can make a conversion between the host name and the internet addresses. And we can interact with this class by either using the name of the host, which would be more convenient rather than using its IP address. And this InetAddress class hides the number inside, so we can interact with the host name too. And this InetAddress class can handle both kinds of addresses like IP version 4 addresses as well as IP version 6 addresses. Now, how do we test any system without a network? How do we test for an IP address without a network? So, we know that any local machine is identified by its local host address or called as the loopback address. So, here we know that there is a class called InetAddress class, and there is a method within this class called getByName. So, this is a static method. GetByName is a static method which is used without instantiating any object for the InetAddress class. So, we can give it as InetAddress.getByName, and within bracket and null would say that you have not supplied any host name, which would retrieve the InetAddress or would create an InetAddress object for the local machine. So, this is also equivalent to creating an InetAddress for the local host by giving a string as localhost. So, use the same method getByName, and you are going to give a string called localhost. This localhost says that it is the local machine, and using this InetAddress class and the method getByName, we get the address or the InetAddress object for the local machine. Or we can use the reserved IP number for the local loopback address. The reserved IP number for the local host is 127.0.0.1. So, you can use the same method getByName and give this reserved IP number. It is a string which would be taken by this, received by this method, and returns the InetAddress of the local machine. And now, in order to identify any machine, we need to have either the domain name or the host name or the IP address, and we know that this if it is the domain name would get mapped to the IP address by the domain name system. So, our domain name is going to be like this, and the dotted quad form of this domain name is given like this. So, you use a method like getByName to retrieve the InetAddress object either by giving the domain name or by giving the it is the host name or by means of the IP address. So, we can use any of these three forms. You can see that all these forms connect to the local host. So, you can use the method get by name, give a null that represents the local host, or use a string localhost that too creates an InetAddress object, or you can use the unique IP address for the local host, or with you can use a method called get localhost. Instead of using get by name, you can use the get localhost, and you need not give any argument, which will also return the InetAddress object. Now, this is a simple program to identify the machine in which I am working. So, you need to, whenever you want to use any of these classes, first import the net package. So, import java.net.star, and then you give a class name within which you have a main method. So, coming here, you want to give the name of the machine in the command line. So, the command line argument is received in the program. So, the command line argument is received in the args array. It is a string array. So, we will check this args.length not equal to 1. So, if you have supplied some parameter command line argument when you execute the program, you can see here Java, the name of the program is who am I, the name of the class who am I, and the local machine system name, local machine name or system name is given. We use the method called get by name. So, it is InetAddress dot get by name, and we give the args of 0, which is the first argument you have given in the command line, by which you have now created an InetAddress object. So, now put a print statement in with Java, it is a system.out.println of the InetAddress object as A. So, this would print the name of the machine, the host name, and its IP, local IP address is 127.0.0.1. Now, we have some of the factory methods that are supported in the InetAddress class, like get localhost, which you have seen in the previous slide. This is to retrieve the localhost InetAddress object, and get by name, this is a static, these are the factory methods, and this receives the host name and creates an InetAddress object. And we also have a method called get all by name. So, these are some of the factory methods, and which is also static methods that are available in the InetAddress class. So, the detailed explanation is given here. Get localhost simply returns the InetAddress object that represents the localhost. Get by name returns the InetAddress by providing a host name, and get all by name receive a host name and returns an array of Inet addresses. So, you can put in an array and you can print all those address objects. And these are some of the instance methods that are supported in the InetAddress class. So, we have a method called equals, which would return true if this object has the same internet address as other. And we have a method, instance method called getAddress. So, this getAddress would return a byte array. We can see here it returns a byte array that represents the object IP address in the byte order, network byte order. And we have a method called getHostAddress, which returns a string that represents the host address associated with the InetAddress object. And we have a method called getHostName, that returns the host name of the local, the InetAddress object of the local machine. And is multicast address would return true if that address is a multicast address, and toString is a conversion from the string from the address object to InetAddress object to a string. And now this is an example how we work with the InetAddress class. So, here you can see that we are creating an InetAddress object called InetAddress. Using get by name, we give an host name javatips.org. So, this now returns an address object. We will try to print its IP address and the host name, that is the InetAddress object ADDR. And now we want to get the host name by a byte array that containing the IP address. So, you can make use of get by address, the method called get by address. So, get by address to which you pass the byte array. So, now provide the IP address to a byte array. This byte array is the parameter passed to the get by address. So, now you try to print the byte array of the IP address given by this passed by this byte array. and now there is a method called get host name. So, this method gets the host name and then it prints it, and then the next one, this would print the local host name, and canonical host name would print get canonical host name would print the fully qualified domain name. Get host name would print only the host name, the IP address, and get canonical host name would give the fully qualified domain name if it is available. So, when you execute the program, you can see the output what you get it. So, we give the host name as javatips.org, whose IP address is given here, and the next one is, you can see that it is we use the method called get by address. So, we pass this IP address as a byte array. We try to print this InetAddress object ADDR1, which prints the local host IP address, and the next one we use the method called get host name. It prints the host name of the local host, and get canonical host name, that prints the same local host because we have not given any specific host name. And now this is another example to check the other methods, instance methods of the InetAddress class. And now, like get by address, you have a method called get address. So, this get address, initially you have you create an InetAddress object by providing the host name. You have created an InetAddress object. Now, on these or this get address, get host address, these are all instance methods. So, with the InetAddress object dot get address, this would return a byte array and you can print it. So, this would be in an hexadecimal form. And then the next method is get host address. So, this returns the host address, and get host name returns the host name. And now you can see here you have created a byte array called IPAddress. So, we have got a string IP address string. This byte array's length you are going to put it in a for loop, you traverse in a for loop and take this byte array and to its length. So, you want to take each string separated by its dot, you identify each of those bytes and you want to print it. So, before you print it, you make a bitwise AND with the 0xFF, which is actually making a AND with the byte what you have received, and then it prints the string of the IP address string, and then you get use the get by address and then use a method called get host name and the other method called get host name for the local host. So, when you can see this for loop would be executed 4 times for each of the byte in the byte array. So, in an IP address there are 4 bytes, you can see the output. So, this is the byte address that is printed in hexadecimal form. The host address is printed with 4 bytes, the host name is printed as javatips, and then the IP address, this is the first byte that is received, and you want to print the other 3 function calls or within this for loop. So, it is getting printed again and again. So, we use get by IP address which prints this, and we use get host name, it prints this. Again it prints the host name of the local host, we use get local host, and then again it prints the first 2 bytes, you can see 62.210, and again it prints the all other things. Again it retrieves the third byte 62.210.93. So, we have put in a for loop, we identify each byte split by a dot and we try to print every time the byte address. And now with the internet address or IP addresses for that is supported for IP version 4 or IP version 6, we have the subclasses of InetAddress classes Inet4Address and Inet6Address. So, beginning with Java version 1.4, we have a support for IPv6 addresses, version 6 addresses. So, either we can work with version 4 addresses, IP version 4, that is using a class called Internet4Address, or with an IP version 6 addresses using a class called Inet6Address. And let us now see about a class, we will get an idea of this URL class. So, this is now available in the net package. This class is also used to identify the files on the internet. So, InetAddress class is to identify the machine, and this URL class is useful for identifying any resource on the internet. So, we know that this URL is a pointer to a resource on the World Wide Web. This resource can be something like a file or a directory, and you can create an URL object using the class constructor call. This is one of the constructors supported in the URL class. So, we have a class called URL class within this net package, which gives a provision for creating an URL object. So, use URL and then give the URL, specify the URL as a string, and then you will get an URL object. And here we can see that there are two classes for URL processing in Java. One is an URL class, the other one is an URL connection class. This URL class is to represent a URL resource, and URL connection class is to represent an open connection to a URL resource. And either you can create an URL object using the constructor. So, say here you can see here how do you create it. You use the constructor of the URL class, specify the URL as a string, you will get an URL object. Now, you can also have an URL representation within the anchor tag, and this is how you use the URL constructor to create the URL objects. There are other URL constructors like URL which takes the protocol, host, port and file. We know that the URL is a string, that is a combination of the protocol. It starts with the protocol, then the host name, port number and the file name. It gives the entire path where the resource is available on the internet. So, you can either create an URL object by specifying each individual parts of the URL, and you can also create an URL object by specifying the protocol name, the host name and the file name. So, your port, without a port number you can create an URL object, directly giving the URL specification and create a URL object, or you can use the URL context and the string, the specification of the URL to create an URL object. So, these are the constructors supported for creating an URL object. Now, we can parse a URL. So, some of the methods that are supported in the URL class are get protocol, get host, get port, get file and get reference. So, get protocol is to get the protocol from the URL, get host is to get the host name specified in the URL, and get port is to get the port number from the URL and the file name from the URL, and you can also, if there is a reference that is normally specified with the hash symbol, that can also be retrieved using get reference. So, the entire URL is a single string specification from which you can parse every part from the URL using these available methods. So, this is a simple example how you parse a URL. So, first you create an URL object giving the entire URL specified as a string, you can see here, and then you can use with the URL object, these are instance methods of the URL class. So, use the URL object dot get protocol to retrieve the protocol as HTTP, and use get host method to retrieve java.sun.com is the host name, and get file would retrieve the path of the file, and get port would retrieve the port number if specified in the URL, and get reference would return the reference within the web page, that would be denoted by a hash symbol. So, you can parse the URL using these methods, and you can identify the individual objects or individual parts within the URL. So, this is an example. You can see HTTP is the protocol, host that is retrieved by get host, file name is retrieved, port is -1, it is not specified in the URL, and reference is down. So, this module we have discussed about the basics for internet programming, and we have also explored about working with InetAddress class for obtaining the internet address of any host machine, and we have also discussed about the URL class and how to parse a URL object. Thank you.